Okay, this week, short week, we only have 4 days, but we are going to be doing a review for an exam on Thursday, exam on Friday. Study guide is up. Hopefully you all have had a chance to take a look at that. Are there any clarification questions I can answer about the study guide, especially as it would help you to study in preparation for our review on Thursday? Hopefully it seems pretty straightforward and not so out there that what do you mean we covered all of this? We didn't cover all this. No clarification questions? You can always ask me individually after class as well. All right, so that's what's happening this week. I still haven't written the exam. I will write it tomorrow. I don't really have enough time, unfortunately, to do it today, but my goal is to have it written ahead of Thursday so that we know. Excellent. So last time, it was a while ago, thanks to our fairly long weekend, we were talking about how different economic markets react and change differently, or how they're structured differently depending on how they are designed. So we had talked about the free market economy. We talked about kind of the player-driven market economy, but where we started talking about the free-to-play economy model as well, where the goal of this economy is to get people to spend a bunch of money on the game. So we tried to figure out, as game designers, how can we design for that, such that the market price of our goods is trying to get as much money from people as possible. How do we know how to set these values? And we found that if we actually look at the market data, so looking at similar games as well, testing our game, and we'll talk about a little bit later how you can test in different markets than you plan to sell in, because there are a lot of markets out there that are very similar to the US market, but we'll get there in a second. So that's the free-to-play economy. Next one, we're going to break this down a little bit and say, okay, how do we actually do this? So if we want to test the market, try to figure this out. So how do you set those initial prices? We can base them off historical data of similar types of games. So if we have any data ourselves, we can analyze historical data and figure out something like how successful has each of these microtransactions been at this associated price. We can look at other similar games. So if you're looking at, you have a game that's very similar to the multiplayer aspects of Clash of Clans, then maybe you can look at the monetizing ideas of Clash of Clans to figure out, okay, if I emulate this, then maybe I can utilize their success as a starting point, assuming that the way the market price shake out is because of some successful system. How do we actually do it? Well, we first need to find some region that is similar to the region that you want to sell in. So if we want to sell to US consumers, we need to find some region to test this game in that is as similar as possible to the US region without it being the US region. You'll find that the Philippines are a very similar nation in terms of gaming preferences, in terms of the amount that's spent on microtransactions, the level of English competency and fluency. A lot of that allows there to be some correlation and causation between the prices that you set if you're going to do a limited test in the Philippines and what you can expect when you release the game in the US. What's nice is you get a nice low cost of acquisition. So you can get a reasonable player base to test your game for cheaper. Filipino players have similar play patterns to American players as well. So you can expect that the data that you collect is quite relevant comparatively. and there's high English competency, so you don't have to worry about there being confusion over your tutorial or over your UI elements that wouldn't necessarily translate markets. The next testing iteration after the Philippines is most frequently done in Scandinavian countries or in Canada before you finally release the game in the US. So you want to do things like tolerance toward pricing. If you set a $50 microtransaction, how frequently is that purchased? What percentage of players actually go for that? You can also look at player drop-off points. You can figure out, all right, of the people who quit the game, where is the distribution of where they quit the game? If they all quit in a similar position, that allows you to circle back around to exactly that point in the game and say, okay, maybe we need a less steep difficulty spike. Maybe we need to prioritize this particular point because this is where players are starting to feel either the pain of having to pay real money, or as the difficulty ramps up, this is where people who choose not to pay money start to struggle and realize or start to see through your plan of getting money from them. Yeah.
Can you check drop-off points?
So if you have particular player accounts, you can look at something like their last login date. Going back into their last login date, what is the last quest they completed? Maybe that's something that you store as part of a player account. Maybe it's something that tells you how far in the game were they? What is the last thing they did? How many total hours did they play? So how long did it take to get them to that point? How many total number of play sessions, unique play sessions were there? Maybe they never took this game very seriously and it took them 6 months to get to this point, and they just came back every couple of months for a little bit and then just never showed up again. Maybe they never took the game seriously in the first place. But that's a great question of trying to find what is that. So that can become a piece of data that's very important to store. What was the last part of the story that was completed? Because then you can come up with, you could make a map of that point to all of those accounts. And then you could do some similarity metric between those accounts to figure out, all right, how similar are they in terms of how old were they? How similar were they in terms of anything else? But I would totally store that on a map. And you could get these kinds of performance indicators from that data. So for all of these players who quit, what was the level of monetization that they gave you? For those who stayed on, how much monetization did they give you? If everyone who hadn't purchased anything leaves at that point, maybe you're actually okay with that. Maybe they just figured out this game isn't for me because I'm not willing to pay money after receiving the game for free. I expected the whole game to be free, and this little bit more aggressive monetization that's trying to get you to pay money, when they start to feel that, they bow out. And again, maybe that's okay or not from the designer's perspective. If 80% of your money is coming from your top 10% of spenders, then you want to design around that. If you lose the other 20%, how much development effort were you spending on that 20% of free-to-play players, free-to-pay players? That's tough. So all sorts of questions that you may be curious about, but there's an answer embedded in the data that you collect. So we call this a soft launch, the idea of launching in some other region or a few other regions and testing out things like how willing are players, because it's really important to get this pricing right the first time. If you don't and decide you want to increase prices, that becomes difficult. We talked about one way to handle that, which is to make absurdly priced microtransactions and then have them frequently or always be on sale to different amounts. If the best sale goes from being 80% off to 75% off, then people don't really bat too much of an eye at that for some reason. So how do we target the associated market that we want? There's this concept called the funnel, and it's in free-to-play games, and it's designed for the funnel. This means that the early levels are very accessible, and the game is designed for players to be successful. You want as many people as possible when they play your game to be roped in or to experience and have fun with the mechanics. But you don't want to design a completely free game that's not going to make you any money. So the fact that they got to play it, think of it like playing the demo for free. But when the demo ends, instead of seeing, please purchase the full game at the end of the demo, now there's something that says you can keep playing, but it's not balanced or designed for that. You need to pay money in order for the curve to be what will feel good to play. So when the demo ends, there is a certain amount of money that you need to put in to continue experiencing that nice, fairly easy, but still increasing in difficulty mechanic. It turns out to be very grindy or very frustrating if you're not putting in the money. So the idea is you want to get as many people playing the game as possible. So that's the opening to the funnel, is get as many players in here as possible. But then, so you want some of those, even a very few amount, will become paying players after they decide, oh, this is actually the best game I've ever played. Of course, I'm willing to support it and throw money at it. You want to find those players, and you only find those players if you get as many people playing the game as possible. But afterwards, you design for just the paying players, those who are actually willing to purchase premium currency or watch enough advertisements to continue to play the game so that you make the money that you need to make up for the player acquisition costs, to pay all of your developers and yourself. The concept of ramped out is what we call if you're just unwilling to spend real money and or find the game too difficult and frustrating, you were ramped out of the game because you were not willing to pay as much into the game as the developers were designing for. And of course, this is by design. Designers actively want you to quit the game at this point if you're not willing to put money in. So you see a concept called targeting the whales. So this is a design philosophy to maximize the retention of players who are willing to spend the most money on the game. So we are actively developing for and targeting just those with deep pockets. Yeah.
Forgot where I saw it, but I saw something that was like almost all mobile games are held up by like their top 5 paying players percent. I mean,
Yeah.
because they pay so much.
Yeah. And that's what the design is for. That's who it's being designed for, is that top 5%. And some games have made it fairly successful to be able to play the game without that pay to win element, but that is not the active design or target audience for the developers. If they're doing that, it's just to get a review boost or just to get some kind of download numbers up or playing numbers up so that they can sell those statistics. You can also try to boost your reviews by finding a place to prompt for a review. If you prompt for a review before the ramp out period of the game, then people who are having fun with the easy early levels before they have quit the game are likely to leave you a positive review, even if they get ramped out and quit the game. That positive review stays around, or if they go back and edit it in a way that says, I was ramped out of this game, they're not going to use that terminology probably, but something that says this has aggressive monetary design, then that's fine, but it does pad your scores depending on where you prompt for reviews. So that actually is a very important design decision in a game. Where are you most likely in your game to get the most positive reviews from that point? We can also talk about how to modify your pricing. So you can always lower your prices, but you can never raise them. How do you test raising prices to see if people are actually willing to spend more? So we talked about this. If you set absurdly high value prices and then offer sales or discounts as the actual base price, then you can just change that % off and very few people notice. The other way you can tackle this is to actually raise the drop rate of premium currency within the game. Or sorry, not change it. If you lowered it, then you could see if people would come back to the store more frequently and purchase more of the premium currency if the game doesn't give you as much. And this is another reason to not publish drop rates, is because you can internally change those drop rates without publishing any kind of patch notes or any kind of information with the player. And if you change it by such a small amount, especially over time, so you don't make one big change, but you'll say, I want to reduce the drop rate of premium currency by 25%. So only 75% is as available as it was. Drop it by 5%. Leave it for a month. Drop it by 5%. Leave it for a month. Drop it by 5%. Leave it for a month. Players will not notice the small decrease over time as much as they would if you changed it by 25% immediately. That would allow you to then, at the end of that period, test and see, are people running into this paywall more or faster? Then you can redouble back to that and make further changes based on whether that change led to more people buying premium currency. Maybe it led to more people quitting the game because they were more frustrated that the premium currency they were getting wasn't dropping enough. But you could then see the effects of that on the game, and you didn't ever publish a news story or anything that said, I'm changing the drop rates of my premium currency. So if players get less of it for free, they may be willing to buy more of it from the store. Or they may play the game longer to be able to farm more of that premium currency. And either of those could be ideal depending on what you're trying to do or what metrics you need to show for the success of your game. You can also change the quantity of premium currency given for the same price. So let's say we have a $5 microtransaction that gives 1,000 gems. If we now say you get 900 gems instead of 1,000 gems for $5, that also has less of an effect on player psychology than actually changing the price of, you now have to pay $6 for your 1,000 gems, or even $5.50 for your 1,000 gems. When it becomes more money, that is the worst way you can get psychological feedback from that'll annoy your players the most. You can also, getting really ethically questionable, change the cost per player. What this means is based on any artificial intelligence or any data that you can gather to try to group people together, you can start to say, based on other players as similar as we can find to you, we can now customize the cost of a particular microtransaction based on your history and willingness to pay. And maybe that leads to a custom discount. So for everyone, it's $50, but the intended price for this is $5. We test and see, all right, are you willing to pay that? If you're willing to pay that, the next offer you get is a little bit worse. Maybe it's for different items, but you couldn't easily tell, is another player getting exactly the same offer as I am? Because it looks like you're just getting random offers from the store. But really that's collecting data about, are you willing to pay for this, yes or no? And given that history, you can start to figure out where is that line where this player is barely willing to pay. If I made it cost a little bit more, they're not willing to pay. If I made them cost less, they would still buy just as frequently. What is that line that gets them to purchase, but it's as expensive as possible? So collecting data like that. If you do that, make sure that in your terms of service and privacy policy, you make sure to talk about that you are reserving the right to customize the price. But if you don't read those, then you don't know that that's going on. And very few people actually read those. Again, ethically questionable, but it is frequently done. So as players purchase more, raise that threshold of the price for the same type of purchase, or scale a factor a little bit higher and raise the price a little bit for the next offer to them, trying to figure that out. So I made sure to put that note. Everything we talk about with free-to-play monetization, I feel like, and I feel ethically obligated to tell people that I think this is ethically questionable, both from a player and a designer perspective. But because it is done, people should be aware of it. You may be asked to interface with it in industry if you ever do this, and if you wanted to design something that was as profitable as possible, that is something that you would at least want to consider. It is annoyingly successful in practice. We see, at least I see, whenever a big new mobile game is released, I think, how is this ever going to be, how is it ever going to work? How is this ever going to be profitable? Or why was this the right decision? And then I look at the financial data the next year, and it becomes obvious that that was the right decision. Even with scaled back mechanics, even with an entire game that doesn't seem to be designed around fun, it's designed around psychological manipulation. It is popular enough And the targeting of the whales is so successful with this that I can't imagine it being that financially successful if it was designed just around fun, which is so frustrating from a designer's perspective, where you just want to design something that people enjoy. What is most monetarily successful? Ethically questionable psychological manipulation. Great. Yeah,
So, regarding the part, under choose professional players, as you know, they were willing to purchase it once. This isn't really a cost per player thing, but I've definitely seen a lot of times, where when, trying to get people to buy, premium currency, they will have like a one-time deal.
yes, that's exactly what that is.
Where, that will have, where it'll say, hey, the first time you purchase this, you get an extra 250 of the currency
Yeah,
instead of just the 1,000.
yeah,
But next time you'll only get 1,000.
yeah, yeah. Getting you to do it once for more currency sets that baseline of, are they at least willing to purchase? But yeah, if you get a pop-up that says special offer, why is that offer not just in the store?
Yeah.
Why is that something that is a pop-up? Because it's being individually targeted to you at that rate. That's why.
Yeah.
All right, prestige economies. So prestige economies are the kind of either cosmetic microtransactions, something where you're purchasing a skin or a skill effect or something that doesn't actually affect the gameplay itself. So because of this, we get a very classic case of supply and demand for this. It looks very much like that. There aren't too many other factors at play. So if you're going to design prestige items, if people are actually going to purchase a microtransaction that only has some kind of visual effect on the game, then you need to design it to be visible. Once a player acquires it, it needs to be something that they want to brag about or show off. If it's more visible to other players, then people who purchase it have a reason to use it. Hey, look, I spent money on this cool flashy effect. And now when I go play with other players, they see the cool flashy effect that I purchased. So it needs to have visibility. So any cosmetics should have visibility. It's very useful if there is a limited quantity of this. You can really create a chase item where people really want to acquire this. So because I've experienced it, I'll go back to the Path of Exile example, but this is the same across many other games that have copied this. But every season, there are free microtransactions that you can grab, free cosmetics from getting achievements in that limited time season. There's no cost to playing, there's no cost to acquiring these aside from playing the game long enough and in a way that you grab these achievements. And as you get these achievements, you get something for free. It's a way of saying, I played the game, I mastered the game enough to acquire this. And if you don't acquire it within that 3-month period of time, you will never be able to acquire it. It goes away. So yeah, fear of missing out allows you to want to play it enough, because if you don't, you will never be able to get it again. And that really has a big effect on the prestige item economy. Now it becomes I don't want to maximize the amount of money that people are playing on my game, paying for my game directly. You want them to play the game long enough to now want to purchase other things. If you can rope players in and keep them coming back on a day-to-day basis, you don't need to create a daily login reward or any other kind of microtransaction-based reward that gets players to log in and play the game. This becomes that type of mechanic. It allows you, it gives you the reason to log in to make progress toward getting this prestige item for free. And if that leads to other purchases, then that leads to other purchases. And they're playing the big game here of, again, targeting the whales, of if the whales are playing this game more frequently, then they will purchase more microtransactions. And it makes it more free-to-play friendly, or they can target both the whales and the general player base and provide more value as a free game if you do something like that type of system. So do note that if you do this, you can change how your players play the game if the prestige item is available within the game. So you can actually get people to come back to play it again. You can keep people playing past when they otherwise would have quit because they have this achievement in their mind of, I want to get this prestige item in the game. So free cosmetics available for completing challenges during a limited time event. That is very specific because it's meant to be a Path of Exile tie-in. But other games are doing this as well, seeing how successful that has been. If you have it for sale, if there's a limited time, you can't acquire this unless you make a purchase within this month or something of the sort. We see this in mobile games. So it may provide additional pressure for you to buy something that you otherwise might not want to buy. So make any purchase in this game and you will get a free skin, limited time skin available with that purchase. Something like that. It becomes the throw-in that gives you the reason to buy this now rather than to wait and buy it later. If I wait until I'm stuck and need the premium currency, then maybe I won't have the ability to get this skin when I want it. So paid cosmetics that are only available for a limited time. And of course, it can range from what I would consider to be fairly ethical, which is the Path of Exile's free cosmetics for completing challenges. I feel like that's fairly fair to everyone. To very questionable, which is everything Star Citizen does. So on a scale of free-to-play game that is released, playable, doesn't force you to buy anything, to the ability to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a digital ship that you can't even really fly around yet because the game's not finalized. That's unfortunate, but that's how it's kind of shaken out. Any questions on prestige economies and designing for prestige economies? Yeah.
I think just one of them that was good, but this was back before or this type of marketing's a lot more adamant was Halo Reach's prestige was really nice. It's because if you saw someone with a flaming skull, one, you knew that they were gonna beat the tar out of you, and two, that looked really cool, and that was a cosmetic you wanted to unlock.
Yeah.
Like to play the game more. And that was something as a kid that kept bringing me back is trying to unlock those items.
Yeah.
Cosmetics was, as I beat the game, I played it well enough, I got this item.
One other really successful way to do that is to offer, you can either purchase this microtransaction or you can play enough to unlock it. And that is also very successful. Against the whales, if you have a ton of money to just throw at games, maybe rather than farm for it, you'd rather just buy it. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you want it to be relatively fair, then you want everything to be acquirable, but you want to make sure enough of your players are actually paying for it that it makes you the money to pay the bills and hopefully make some profit on top of it. All right, we're going to move on and talk about inflation because that is something that is very important in designing games. We see it, there's a lot of effort that's done to curb this in the real world. That means that there's also a lot of work that needs to be done to curb this in games.
You make inflation in a video game.
Oh, it's very easy. Yeah.
RuneScape is known for this.
So basic definition of inflation, an increase in the price of goods and services. And we can break this down into two further variables, supply side inflation and demand side inflation. So what does it look like and what causes that inflation from each side of the supply and demand curve? So let's start with supply side inflation. So what has to happen in an economy for the price of goods and services to rise because something changed from the supply side? What would that look like? What needs to happen?
Supply, it dwindles and moves, there's less of it.
If supply changes from that reason, okay. With the, so yeah, if the price is gonna rise, yeah, what has to happen to supply for price to rise?
Supply is the lower, so it's a lot more competition to get those
Mhm.
resources.
So if that becomes true, there's one even bigger cause to this in games. Yeah,
It's just like other games just kind of compete with like. For example, like WoW is like the main like MMO RPG, and
yeah,
like those are the same thing with like 2D.
yeah, we get big supply side inflation when more currency enters the market than leaves it. And this can be any particular kind of object as well, but when more of it is entering than leaving, it accumulates and accumulates and accumulates and starts to lose value. When that currency loses value, then the cost of a certain amount of work is going to go up and up and up and up. So an hour of my time, suddenly the cost of goods and services, there's just so much money in the system. There's now twice as much money, but the same amounts of goods and services. What's going to happen to the price of every item? It's going to double because proportionally, we need it to cost the same proportion of the total amount of money that's available. We see this in games with any item that has value in the game. If gold is a main currency and the only way to get rid of gold is to purchase something, but as designers, we've made the items easy enough to acquire that it's not reasonable to spend gold as much as it is when you go to farm an item, it drops immediately. Or I actually need to purchase one of those. Oh wait, I already have 12. I'm good. If you don't need to sink the gold, then the gold just accumulates and loses its value. If now you wanted to trade a player some gold for some item that you didn't have, you would need to give a lot of that gold because that gold doesn't have a ton of value. There's not a lot you can do with that gold that you can't get in some other way. So gold farmers in World of Warcraft, any botting, this is something from a designer's perspective that you can try to control for. Currency enters the economy through the normal play of the game, and if you balanced it to be through the normal play of the game, when people write bots to go farm currency that aren't real players doing it, they don't have the same demand level as other real players because the goal is to set them up to farm gold to give to a main account. Yeah.
One of the reasons TF2 was unplayable for years was because they were just filled with bots farming for trading cards and hats and stuff.
Yeah.
And no one could play.
Yeah. What is it like to engage as a person versus an economy that is some proportion bot? If it is 2% bot or less, maybe it's fine. But as soon as it becomes 70% bot, what can a real human with their level of optimization reasonably do in the economy? You're not comparable to the efficiency of a bot that can play 24 hours a day. Even if you're more efficient when you farm, you're not going to be playing it that frequently. So there ends up being massive inflation because you can get twice as much gold in the system because so many bots are doing it. So when players can sell currency for real money on third-party sites, that's especially problematic because now the way to get the currency isn't by playing the game. It's by buying it on a third-party site. That will give you many hours worth of progress because their gold farming bots, one, are unlimited in their number, and two, are able to sell it because there's no use for them that much of that currency. So the gate becomes very cheap on a per money basis to buy in-game currency. I've analyzed the Path of Exile third-party market, and it's very interesting to think that what would take me about 10 to 20 minutes in-game to farm up is something that's available for 50 cents or less on a third-party market, which means that I'm valuing my time while playing the game at something like $4 per hour. Maybe, if that. And if I could just jump ahead paying $4 and not play the game for an hour in terms of farming, is that worth it? For some people, that's going to be a yes. And so the way that they play the game is to pay for the currency to avoid the farm to go play the game, which further incentivizes people to bought the game because it's profitable.
You can point to a design flaw if people are not wanting to play the game and the farming isn't fun, that it is a revealing design flaw.
Yeah, yeah. So you can see that the actual equilibrium here is not so much set by the players of the game. Now it can become influenced by the bots that are written to play the game. So the only way to acquire the currency is to pay people who bought, which further incentivizes the botting. So as a designer, there are some things you can do about this. You want to make sure there are enough sinks in your economy so that anything that enters the game has a way to leave the game that is reasonable. The players actually want and have reason to spend their currency on it. So a sink is just somewhere you can spend that resource to remove it from the economy. So if it's gold, then it would be purchasing something from the store. If it's a Path of Exile currency item, then you use it when you craft something. So it's sync whenever you want to engage in crafting, then you will be syncing the currency that you could use to trade for something else by using it to make an item better. That means that as a designer, you have the responsibility to monitor your economy and figure out, are these market prices making sense given the player patterns that we are seeing? So how could we determine something like this? Let's say as a designer, we wanted to find bots. How do you do that? How would you write a program to try to figure out whether an account is botting or not? Any ideas? Yeah.
This is just taking a story from someone who was part of this hunt back in WoW, was that initially what they do is they have the bots just run to one spot. So they just put a rock right in front of that path, and then they just ban all the players still running forward against that rock for about 12 minutes.
Yep. That could be a good way to do it. Any other ideas of how you might want to do that? Yeah, looking at game times might be reasonable. So someone who's been playing the game for a really long time. Of course, you could get around that if in your script you just said log out and back in pick an amount of time between 30 and 60 minutes. Randomize that time, log out, log back in, keep going. From a designer's perspective, your players are going to be very smart. They're going to figure out what rules get around your banning. But the other really big consideration that creates a big problem in player bases is the actual threshold for tolerance for this. This leads to what we're going to call a false positive rate. How many times do you ban someone when they weren't botting? For botting? What process do you have for them to say that ban wasn't fair? You actually appeal your ban. How frequently, when you're appealing and you allow the player to keep going, was that an actual bot? And they were just trying to protect themselves. So that's a very big challenge as a designer, is to keep your economy pure. So real players accused of or banned for botting who haven't done any botting. That's the bad outcome when you try to ban people for botting, is how do you know that person was botting? How frequently are you banning someone who wasn't doing that? Yeah.
CSGO had a system that would record just kind of everyone playing, and then if someone got reported, it would take that clip, and then I think it was like players who volunteered would watch those clips, and if like someone's clearly just shooting through a wall or something, they're like, yeah, that's botting.
Yeah.
But if it's like, oh no, they actually did it, it wasn't.
Yeah. So you're relying on either players volunteering their times or some kind of manual review. Maybe that is people who are paid, but that's an additional expense. Something you have to consider when you're budgeting. How expensive is it going to be to hold this live service game? What about false negatives? Players who are actually botting but go undetected. Usually you have some kind of trade-off between your false positives and your false negatives. As you raise the threshold for your false positives, you start banning more and more and more people. You get all of the botters, but you're gonna start to capture some real players as well. And that's unfortunate. So you lower it and you realize that as you lower it, you're catching fewer of the people who are botting. But now players, if you're not botting, you're less likely to be accused of botting because the threshold for accusing someone or banning them is lower. So figuring out where that threshold should be is a very important data science problem. You're going to want to weigh your false positives versus your false negatives. What is your tolerance for both of those bad outcomes? Is there a better one and a worse one? Would you rather have some bots in the economy and have very few people who are banned for botting who weren't botting, or would you rather have a very pure, no bots in the economy, but some proportion of your player base who isn't botting are being banned? Any thoughts on that?
Seems dangerous to ban people who aren't botting.
That could be very bad PR, yeah.
Just gotta work with the botters, tell them to give percentage.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, you can bot, but you need to give us a cut, otherwise you.
Some games we could do something like that, and that would be, maybe some people would still want to play that game, but I imagine once that became public knowledge, that would turn quite a few players off of actually wanting to involve themselves in that system.
Like the WoW bot mafia.
Yeah. Bot fiat,
Yeah, pretty much.
we'll go with that. So that's the supply side inflation, is too much of something is entering the economy. The demand side inflation, what is it when those who are needing or buying the goods, how can they inflate? So when we evaluate, the player base as a whole reevaluates the usefulness of a resource. For some reason, via some kind of balance change, something of the sort. So any new content that changes the metagame, a big balance pass that changes the metagame, any new strategies that are published by the player base, that becomes common information. So it changes the actual relative demand of each of the items. You can also have an entire player base be willing to pay more for something. And if that's the case, if everyone becomes willing to pay more, then we get demand side inflation. So in a positive sum economy, more of a resource is entering the economy than leaving it. All players have more of the resource, so the conversion becomes a problem. More players have more money. More players are willing to spend more of it for the same goods. And we can offset it by introducing higher priced goods to the game. If there's a new sink for more in-demand goods, that will remove more of that extra resource from the game. If we have the ability to, if players are selling things to stores or anything that we have control over as a designer, we can increase the existing goods market price. Players don't like it when the designers go through and make changes like that, which is probably good. You can also straight up decrease the drop rates. And that means that less of that resource will be coming into the economy so that we don't have demand side inflation. Questions on demand side inflation? Really just who's responsible for the extra inflation, and it can be both. Some issues with inflation. So first and foremost, and this is a little counterintuitive, given that as a society, we view inflation as bad, but by itself, inflation is not bad. That said, there are some poor outcomes for inflation, especially in a game-based setting, that we should be aware of. So if everyone in your economy is all making more of a particular resource, then the purchasing power remains the same. that just means that the market price is going to shift, maybe it even doubles, but if you have twice as much of that resource, it still proportionally costs the same as it did before. I make $50,000 a year, and the price of something relevant, a textbook, is $100. It's exactly the same proportion of my income as if I made $100,000 and the textbook cost $200. So if everything costs twice as much, but I make twice as much, it's the same proportionally. And if that's true across all of your players, then the market is exactly the same. You haven't really changed anything about your market except scaling all of the prices by a certain amount. So that is okay. The issues, when this is caused by botting or wealthy players hoarding all of the resources, that's bad. You can imagine that as a player in a game, let's say for some reason, I control 30% of the entire game's resources across all players. I just have that much wealth in my account. Then when I want to, I can go purchase just about all of a particular existing item, driving up the price immensely because there's just no supply for it. And then I decide to start selling that item at whatever I want to sell it at. That means that there was inflation on that item, but it was not people fairly and equally making more. It was because I decided to personally manipulate the price of an item because I was wealthy enough to be able to do that. That's only sustainable if I have the ability to sell enough of that back to the player economy to make up for my investment. But if I have the money to do something like that, then I can sit on it and make sure that that happens. Also note that if there is real world money in your game, then if there is inflation and you need to pay now more of a premium currency to acquire something, then unless you get twice as much premium currency for the money that you're investing in the game, that can really affect how much people want to spend real money on your game. So if that's due to botting and those bots are making a lot of premium currency such that there's an oversaturation of premium currency in the market, people may be buying that premium currency from third-party sites or from other players rather than directly from you, the designer. That's a huge problem. On the other hand, some games' entire business model surrounds this exact idea. So take that as you will. One other point to consider when you have inflation is that new players will need to farm more to catch up and be competitive with existing players. If you haven't gone back and balanced your tutorial, the early parts of the game to get them the resources to be able to catch up with that inflation, they will find that by the time they hit a level of supply and demand consistent with other players who have been playing the game for a while, they don't have the resources to be competitive with the market. And that can be a reason why new players would quit your game. Another consideration, if you have a player who played for a while under the pre-inflation economy, takes a long break from the game, comes back to the game, and sees this new post-inflation economy, the actual net worth of their account has significantly degraded during their absence. And that could be a reason why they don't want to re-engage with the game. When I left, I was relatively wealthy. When I come back, I can't afford anything. I'm no longer engaged with the game because it feels like the game didn't respect my absence. Something happened. So as a designer, you want to be aware of all of these different kinds of player types. And if that leads to a change, what change should we make to make sure that we're prioritizing new players, existing players that have been on a long hiatus, people like that, while still giving the existing everyday players something to do and farm for. So we need to figure out ways to get currency or items out of the game. So how do we remove resources from a game? We can add items to purchase from NPCs. You can make those costs lower than the associated buy costs, of course. And that way, those who purchase an item have to sink more of the currency to get it, and then you can sell the item back And that sinks the item from the economy and gives back a small amount of gold. So doing that allows that cycle, the purchase and sell cycle sinks money. Any gambling or exchanging currency for an unknown item, if you make the expected value of that acquisition particularly low, then anyone who engages with it is sinking currency with the hope that that currency becomes exchangeable for something that is valuable. People are addicted to gambling, so they will engage in it at a net loss. If you add item durability, which nobody likes, people have to pay to repair those items, and that becomes a sink to the game. If there are penalties for dying, any monetary penalties for dying, or maybe something like your entire inventory is left on the ground and is gone by the time you revive. That is unfortunate, but that becomes a sink or something that players have to now prioritize and farm around. So be careful when you do something like including penalties for dying, that you're not only punishing either lower skilled players or those who don't have the currency to afford the big upgrades, because then this sink is only coming from the least wealthy players in your player group, and that's also kind of bad. You don't want this to just be a tax on the poorest players. You can also allow limited time items for very large amounts of a particular resource. If you're wealthy, you can afford this skin, you can afford this something, and then that currency all leaves the game for something that is not relevant to the actual balance of the game. You can add trade fees. Something like a trade fee says that whenever you engage with trading with other players, it's going to cost you something to engage with that. If that's the case, then every time a trade happens, something leaves the economy as well. There's the concept of positive sum mechanics. Anything that when you sell something, buy something, and you end up with more of it than you had before you engaged with it. So think of it like an infinite loop to acquire something. Make sure that you're aware of those and can remove them. Last thing we can worry about is a worst case, full economy reset, push the button and detonate the entire economy. And we find games that have things like seasons or cycles, something that allows you to do this full economy reset, where it's designed, the economy has massive inflation, but then it gets wiped and we just start over. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do something like that in real life? Do an economy reset. All right, we'll pick this up tomorrow. Working our way toward fun new things.